government, even in a pluralist society like here in the United States or in Canada, where people have diverse moral understandings. This is generally a pre-Vatican II vision in which religiously grounded government directly shapes individual morality in very specific ways. In this vision, Catholic government officials would be expected to integrate religious teaching directly into government, no matter the diversity of the community that they led. So this is the deep ground for considering Catholic officials in government today. And I have three questions that I want to pursue with you. So the first question is, I want to know, are Catholic officials, so are Catholics in government, different? Secondly, how do Catholics govern? And then finally, what we can learn about religion-state relations more generally through this narrow lens. And here's a quick preview of where we're going. So I'm going to, I think, give some description that Catholic officials are somewhat different. I'm going to describe how they endorse what I call basic separationism of religion and government. And I'm also going to talk about how their religious identity alongside political identity and community context shape views about religion-state relations. But let's really set the context of religion-state relations in the United States, the place where I'm going to be talking about officials. And let's go way back. So we'll go back to the US Constitution. There are two clauses in the Bill of Rights that are relevant that I've highlighted here. They're known as the free exercise and the non-establishment clauses. Now, there's an interesting scholarship about how these were drafted and what the authors at the time meant, but I would like to focus on the meaning of these over time for Americans. It's clear that quite quickly, one metaphor came to influence the collective memory of Americans, as well as the thinking of many leaders about these constitutional clauses. And that metaphor, of course, is Thomas Jefferson's wall metaphor. This is drawn from a letter he wrote to a group of Baptists in Connecticut who had been worried in the early years of the Republic about how religion and state might be connecting. And as Jefferson writes here, he reinforces the clauses from the Constitution, and then he mentions this wall between, or a separation between church and state. Now, this metaphor never captured the complexity of actual governmental practice on the ground, but it became a tool over time in the United States for dealing with religious change. And in the 20th century, it actually was embedded in law as a way to introduce some limits on religion in public institutions like schools, for example. Now, in opposition to this metaphor, over the past 25 years, the Supreme Court in the United States has ushered in a new era of what's known as accommodationism, where church and state are permitted to be closer, maybe even entangled with each other in new ways. So, for example, the court has ruled that local government meetings can start with sectarian prayers. It's said that public school employees should be able to not be neutral and to even lead prayers during public school events. It has exempted some religious groups from some laws, and it has allowed support for sectarian monuments like crosses on public grounds. And it's actively not used the separationist metaphor. But I want to suggest that we shouldn't see this change as just coming from the Supreme Court. It was actually the result of advocacy organizations working against the metaphor over a couple decades. Now, this graph, which is a little messy, I apologize for that, but it's from some unpublished work that a student of mine did, where he analyzed using big data techniques stories from the New York Times. And what the blue line shows is that somewhere around the year 2004, the language of separation drastically declined in New York Times articles about religion. And instead, it's been replaced by two phrases, religious liberty and religious freedom. So just before Supreme Court jurisprudence changed, elite cultural conversation in the United States had already changed, moving towards free exercise as the main principle to guide religion-state relations, and not necessarily non-establishment. But in the general public, the separation principle lives on. So this is a Pew survey from 2021 that shows that more than 50% of Americans believe that the federal government should, quote, enforce the separation of church and state. Only a minority of Americans appear to clearly desire change away from separationism. So Americans now live in an era in which, legally speaking, separation is not meant to be the guiding principle, but the collective memory of separationism lives on. Now, as a result, I think there's kind of a conflict and a confusion about how religion and state should interact. And I like when I'm teaching to catch some of this confusion with editorial cartoons. So for example, this is one cartoon that basically is kind of a cynical read about these changes, suggesting that instead of a wall, there's now maybe a stained glass window in which religious groups maybe have access to public funds in the way they haven't before. Or here's another cartoon, pretty cynical cartoon that thinks that basically now people are going to line up with their own ideas of what the moral good is and only agree to uphold those ideas and not others. And then this one is directly in relation to a decision a couple years ago about a public high school football coach in the state of Washington who, after the game on the field, would lead sectarian prayers with his students. And of course, this one's meant tongue in cheek to suggest if the case had been brought by what we might call a very non-traditional religion, would it have worked out in quite the same way that it did? So with this as background, I think it's an open question how governmental leaders think about religion-state relations and how their own religiosity impacts it. So to explore this issue, my colleagues and I, as Carol Ann mentioned, decided about a decade ago now to focus on local officials to understand these things. Why local officials? Well, local officials have urgent issues on their mind other than religion and state relations, and they make a lot of decisions in relation to their local community and its needs. And then, frankly, there are lots of local officials. In the United States alone, there's over 30,000 local governments. I imagine the number in Canada is not as big, but I assume it's still pretty big in the thousands. And now, more than ever, these group of people, most of whom have zero expertise about the law that's supposed to guide religion-state relations, are being encouraged to actually make connections between government and state. So let me just really quickly tell you how a sociologist approaches studying this sort of topic. And I can say more in my discussion, but let me give a quick rundown. First, my colleagues and I draw from research that shows that local officials are really pragmatic. They're constrained by time, and they're constrained by resources and their role. And because of this, we should not expect that a clear path would go from an official's religious identity to their governance. Second, we know that citizens and officials, their ideas of the law are not the same as the law itself. So what officials do is they enact their sense of what is legal, often unaware of what the law actually is or how it could apply. Third, we know from other sociologists that there is usually not a straight path from religious identity to the behaviors of individuals in a religious group. Instead, officials, like people in general, can have multiple identities, both religious and civic, and we shouldn't think that these are zero-sum identities. And then fourth, in our work, we build on really great work that's being done on religious pluralism. And one of Canada's great sociologists of religion, Laurie Beeman, is actually one of the leaders, I really think, in this field. So with this in mind, let me tell you quickly about the study that we did. So our study included numerous elements, but most importantly, we had a survey that went out. On the right hand of the screen there is the survey web page that officials could go to. We sent them a letter inviting them to do the survey. They went to the web page, and then this is what they saw at the beginning of the survey. Our survey ended up with about a 9% response rate, which is actually pretty good for government officials. And then 6 months later, we did follow up interviews with officials. We asked them about why they are in government. We asked how they work with local religious groups, and we asked about how they wanted religion and government to interact or not. But importantly, and keep this in mind, we in our interviews never introduced the metaphor of separation into our conversations. We left that out because we didn't want to bake the answers as they responded to us. So now I'm going to start sharing some data from that study. But before I do it, I want to just give a quick shout out to my collaborators. Carol Ann and Sarah probably know all of these people from conferences, but we've been working together for nearly a decade across a number of institutions to do this research. Now, our survey is representative of officials based on the size of communities of where Americans live in the United States. So this gives you a sense of the presence of certain size type communities in our sample. And here, I just quickly put up the distribution of religious affiliations amongst local government officials in the United States. And I wanted to point out that the percentage of Catholic officials almost perfectly matches the percentage of Catholic adults in the US general public. And I'm going to use these religious affiliation categories on the next few slides. So let's get to our first main question. Are Catholic officials different? So on these next couple of slides, I break down officials by religious affiliation on the left. Each bar shows how officials within one religious affiliation do an activity or support a belief. The left-hand dark side indicate those with the highest intensity, and the dotted line is merely there to help us realize that there's big differences across religious affiliations. So here, for example, we see that local officials who identify as conservative Protestant report the most worship attendance. 40% of them claim to have attended worship in the previous week. Catholic officials are about in the middle. 20% of Catholic officials reported that they attended religious worship the past week. And this middle position keeps recurring. We asked them in the survey about their frequency of prayer, and lo and behold, we found out that Catholics here in the middle, about 45% of Catholics report that they pray daily, less than some Protestants, more than some other religious groups, including the non-affiliated. When we asked officials how much personal guidance they received from religion, you guessed it, Catholics were again near the middle. So just over a quarter of Catholic officials said they received a great deal of guidance from their religion. Some Protestants were much higher, and not surprisingly, the non-affiliated were lower in answering this question. And then with spiritual identity, about 1/3 of Catholics said that they considered themselves very spiritual. Another 50% of Catholics see themselves as moderately spiritual. But again, they're in the middle of all other types of religious affiliation. So summing up a bit, Catholics are in a middle ground in terms of their religiosity. And for a sociologist of religion like me, that's actually not that surprising because Catholics have been this way for a long time in all sorts of ways in terms of their religiosity in the United States. They're distinct. So let's move to our next question. How do Catholic officials govern? In our interviews, we asked officials to talk about how their religious identity might connect to their work. So in these next slides, I'm going to actually share words of Catholic officials from our interviews with them. This slide shows an official giving us their motivation, which they connect to their spirituality. As they say, I got involved in politics to support, save, whatever you want to say, my town. And I think that comes from a spiritual place of wanting to do the right thing. This next slide expresses some of what Alexis de Tocqueville once called habits of the heart. He suggested that religion forms some values that could impact democracy. So here the official says, you know, I try to be like peaceful and understanding and non-judgmental. And then goes on to say that he especially tries to be that way with people that might be having a conflict with him. This next official notes how religion, in a somewhat quiet way, animates their work for the vulnerable. So She says, I recognize that advocating for the most vulnerable is my top priority. I do bring my faith. I'm not going to push it off on anyone. I'm not going to evangelize, but people are going to know that my faith forms my values. In summary, Catholic officials perceive their faith influencing their work primarily in indirect ways, through their civic values or for their concern for their community. But now let's pivot a little bit and let's look at how Catholic officials think about religion state issues, kind of the core theme of our talk tonight. So in this group of slides, we're only looking at Catholics. The horizontal bars categorize Catholic officials by their political affiliation. I included political affiliation because there's a lot of commentary in the US about the Catholic Church being politicized and about how political identity might override Catholic identity. This specific slide shows whether Catholic officials think that religious freedom is respected in their local community. The large majority think religious freedom is completely or somewhat respected in their local community. And the dotted line helps to point out that the response among Catholic officials does not differ by political identity. So for this perception, political identity doesn't matter. What I want to point out is if when we ask this question a slightly different way, when we ask about whether religious freedom is respected nationally, the percentages plummet. This is a thing we find in surveys. Actually, people tend to think things are much better in their communities than in the country as a whole. And then here we see that Catholic officials are overwhelmingly not supportive of Christian nationalism. Less than 10% completely or somewhat agreed that the federal government should declare Christianity as the official religion. And again, as the dotted line shows, among Catholic officials, there is very little difference by political identity. Here, we see that about 3/4 of Catholic officials completely or somewhat agree that there should be a high wall of separation between church and state. There's some difference by political identity, but the big takeaway is that more than 70% of Catholic officials appear to value separationism, and it's at a higher level than among the general public. So these past three slides have suggested an agreement among Catholic officials, no matter their political affiliation, about some general issues related to religion-state relations. First, that religious freedom is not embattled in their communities. Second, that Christian nationalism is illegitimate. And third, that the principle of separation is important to them. So I'd like to think a little bit more about this principle of separation because, to be frank, our team was a little shocked at how supported it was in our survey. And we were even more surprised when we interviewed officials because the separation language and ideas kept coming up. So I'm going to take you back to their officials' words to see if we can understand what separationism means. So we heard officials talk about what I call a basic separationism, and they talked about it in two ways. One way was in connection to their government role. So here's an official talking about preventing their beliefs from impacting their duties. They say, there's a huge wall in my brain between the two entities. I would never let my personal beliefs inform my political duties. I represent my people. Now, this role and partiality seems in tension with some of those earlier slides I showed you about how officials felt that their religion formed their work. But this value of impartiality, I think, is not actually at odds with their religion, because here they're talking about their role, their legal role in representing their community and their legal duties. Similarly, here, an official notes the value of impartiality. They even suggest the importance of being secular. They say, no, in here, I'm secular. I can't let that color my activities or my performance. Note that this is rather opposite of what recent Supreme Court decisions have assumed, which is that religious officials might not want to be secular in moments like this. And then here again, An official brings up both how their religious identity shapes them in an abstract way, but also how religion does not directly shape their decisions in governing. This official says, these Catholic morals, they help me make some decisions, but I don't let that really influence a lot of what gets done because there's really nothing for it to influence, or at least there shouldn't be. Another way we heard officials talk about this basic separation was in relation to their leading of their local communities. Here, an official notes how separation protects community peace, lest each election lead to officials instituting their beliefs. So this official says, what's going to happen when I lose office? And somebody of a different religion wants to legislate their beliefs. And for them, this is the best reasoning possible for separation of church and state. Here, another official discusses how religion could shape the local community, but this official offers no specific example. Instead, they introduce the famous specter of the Spanish Inquisition to articulate their opposition to imposing religious beliefs or distinct religious policies. And here, an official discusses how separationism is related to equal treatment in government. This official says, I'm about as Catholic can be. And I'm also very observant of the bright line of separation of church and state. Everybody has to have representation, so we don't play favorites. And here, an official says something similar, connecting it to their religious beliefs, but they go a step further. They notice how this commitment to equal treatment is in tension with their political party. And then they use some colorful language to endorse this idea of equal treatment. Overall, I've come to think of these words from official as evidence of a basic separationism, an orientation towards governing that values impartiality, worries about civic peace, and pursues equal treatment in government affairs. But when we turn towards examining specific religion-state policies that officials have to make decisions about, things get a little bit more complex. So our survey and our interviews asked officials about lots of religion-state policies. When a sociologist gets a chance to ask questions, they ask tons of questions. But I want to just focus on two important ones here. So the policies I'm going to share a little bit about are about having prayer at public meetings and about having public holiday displays on government property. These two policies share a number of features. First off, they involve public religion. So how religious symbols show up in government-controlled space. Second, they invoke questions of civic identity, who the community is, and what religions should be represented as a part of it. Next, there is not just one strategy to solving these policy dilemmas. There's multiple options. So the separation principle that I spent a lot of time talking about doesn't easily map onto these policies. And finally, as we found out in some analyses we've done, these policies are impacted by a whole bunch of things: religious identity, political identity, and community identity. So one policy that gets a lot of attention in the United States, at least, is prayer at public meetings. In 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that sectarian prayers at local meetings of the government are legal, and they even seem to encourage prayers taking place. Now, it didn't take too long for in my home state to see some news about how sectarian prayers could be divisive in a society that's pluralistic, that's religiously diverse. So what do local officials think about public prayers? So this slide again has our local officials sorted by religious affiliation. The dark gray indicates opposition to having prayers. So on the survey, they said they were opposed. The light gray, blue, and green parts of each bar indicate support for a type of prayer that's not sectarian. Maybe they favored a moment of silence, or maybe they favored a prayer from any religious tradition. They didn't care. Overall, about half of all officials want prayers at meetings, which means half don't. And there are big differences by religious affiliation. Most officials with no religious affiliation do not want these prayers. The large majority of conservative Protestants do, and they're the most likely group to want a prayer from their own tradition. That's the red portion of the bar on the screen. Catholic officials, and you've heard this theme before, are somewhere in the middle. They mimic the general population in that half of Catholic officials don't want public prayers. But those that do, they want prayers that are potentially diverse or open to lots of different religious traditions. Now, this slide only looks at Catholic officials and brings back those political affiliations that I showed you before. And we see some big differences amongst Catholic officials by political affiliation. Over 60%, and this line, what this line points out to us is that if all the lines above it don't line up with the vertical line, we know there's differences between their political affiliations. So over 60% of Catholics, Democrats do not want prayer, but only 1/3 of Catholic Republican officials say this. So let's look at their words really quick and see how partisanship and community context shape these opinions. Here's one Catholic reflecting on why they don't want prayer, even though they personally love prayer. This is a Democrat in a large city, and their discomfort seems to come from the pluralism of their community. She writes, I think it should be separate because I see the impacts. Every Tuesday, we start with a prayer that makes me really uncomfortable. And I love prayer, and I love God, and I love all that stuff. But the prayer, is always centered on Catholicism or Christianity. And for me, I'm like, we've got folks that are Jewish, Muslim, agnostic, don't believe in God. It feels to me like a force of belief on others. And here is one Catholic reflecting, here's another Catholic, also a Democrat from a large city, expressing a similar wariness. However, they suggest prayer could work. But as they say, they'd want to cater to everybody, like maybe in some sort of rotation where different religious groups in a diverse setting could each have their turn on the prayer cycle. But note here, an official who is a Republican from a much smaller area favors these prayers personally. He does note that the topic should be up to community debate, so the community should debate it out and vote and decide whether there should be prayers, but he supports it. And here, another Republican from a small area supports prayers, but without the voting proviso. And he shares a unique strategy for people, including himself, to basically tune out all the prayers you don't like and just listen to the ones you do. So in the 50 prayers that happen in his meetings over the year, 48 of them aren't Catholic. So as he says, he stands up and tunes out. So in summary, Catholic officials towards prayer and government meetings are complicated. Half don't want prayer, half do, but partisanship, so their political identity, and their community context play a role in their opinion on this. Now, the last policy I want to talk about is one that the court has recently changed regarding sectarian religious symbols and government displays. This is my hometown of State College during December. You got to come and visit here if you haven't been here. And when you do come, let me know that you're here. So this is what the downtown shopping area looks like right in the middle of December. And here, across the street on public property, is our Christmas tree. And here, down the street, is a menorah, also on government property. Now, my colleagues and I have shown in other research that the large majority, maybe 75% of American communities, have government-sponsored holiday displays like these. But we've also shown that most displays only have a Christmas tree. A minority of them, at least till now in American history, have religious symbols like the menorah in this case. And in our survey, most officials wanted a public display. 60% were supportive, but here, again, we see big differences by religious affiliation. Amongst officials with no affiliation, only 40% wanted a holiday display. Catholics, again, were somewhere in the middle. 2/3 wanted a holiday display. But the light blue and the green segments of that bar indicate that they want displays that are diverse. So they want them, but they want ones that maybe capture some of the diversity, the religious diversity in the community. By contrast, about 1/3 of conservative Protestant officials don't want a display, and they're the group most likely to want a display that reflects the religion of their community. Again, looking at Catholic officials by political affiliation, you can see some differences. So 60% of Catholic Democrats want displays, but 80% of Catholic Republicans do. And interestingly, independent Catholic officials are the most opposed to them. I'm not sure why that is. We can think about that later if you have ideas. But let's turn again to their words to get a sense for how this shaping by political identity and community context happens. I have just 2 more quotes and then we'll wrap everything up. So here we have a Republican who ironically is using separationist language, but then immediately says that he's looking out while he's doing this interview with one of our team, and he's looking at the town square. And in a week after our interview, that town square is going to have a holiday display, and there's going to be a menorah, and there's going to be a nativity scene. So this is clearly an example of somebody who wants a holiday display, but is also open to many possible religions being a part of that. Here, in contrast, is a Republican official from a smaller town, and they're more exclusive. They interpret their Christmas tree as a connection that the government is making to the religious identity of the community. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor for how these religious or how these holiday displays can evoke these kind of controversial religious meanings, or I should say potentially controversial religious meanings. Okay, let me sum up. So Catholic officials are a bit different. They're moderate in their religiosity, and they're kind of in the middle of other religious groups when it comes to a lot of policies, especially those about prayers and about having holiday displays. We saw from their words that they connect religion to their governmental work through indirect ways. Their values are shaped and their concerns are shaped. But they don't want Catholicism in government. So in opposition to some of those Catholic intellectuals I mentioned earlier who are kind of destabilizing ideas about Catholicism and democracy, most Catholic officials subscribe to what we call a basic separationism, which echoes core elements of liberal democracy: individual freedom, equal treatment, tolerance. It involves role impartiality, their willingness not to impose their beliefs on a diverse public. But at the same time, there is real difference among Catholic officials in some specific policies, those that have to do with having religious symbols present in public. And we were only able to explore this a little bit here, but we think it's due, the differences of opinions are especially due to political identity and community context. So what can we learn about religion-state relations more broadly? So first, to reiterate, most officials have a basic separationism that works to set boundaries between government and religion as a way of respecting religious liberty. Second, officials definitely differ on local policies and sometimes in striking ways. And then third, these differences are related to religious identity, community, and political identity. So I wanted to end here with a slide that suggests where our conversation might go. I'm wondering how much of this can easily or not translate to the Canadian case. And these are a couple of my hypotheses, is that maybe with a different Supreme Court structure, maybe with a less polarized public, and then also with some high profile visible experiments in kind of multicultural secularism, I'm wondering if Canada just has more in the toolbox for how to deal with some of these issues. So I'll pause there. I look forward to your comments. Thank you for sticking this long. Let's see if you can stick with us a little bit longer.
Thank you so much, Gary. We do have some time now for questions, so I welcome folks to raise their digital hand or to come on screen to kind of signal that they want to ask a question or to put a question in the chat. All are welcome. John Malloy, great to see your name in part because John is with the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, and I missed him at the start. And did we lose John there for a second?
No, no,
Oh,
I'm here.
perfect. Okay, it's
I'm
just
here.
my screen. John, please.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around what a Catholic response to or a Catholic policy beyond something like you've mentioned prayer or holiday display, or if you want to take it to a different level of government, something like abortion or medical assistance in dying, that sort of thing. I mean, I think of a situation where a community might be very opposed, for example, to a homeless shelter. The democratic will is don't do it, don't raise taxes for it, whatever. I mean, we can build up any type of scenario, and a certain politician might say, you know what, I want to go ahead with it because of my faith, because I feel as a Catholic I need to care for the poor. I need to go against the public will, or I need to have certain priorities which are not the priorities of my voters. That's serious in one sense, because you could call it anti-democratic. I mean, that's a whole different discussion, but they are really being driven by their faith. So I'm just trying to get my head around, and I'm fascinated by these interviews. What did these participants see as a religious or a faith-based decision? You've picked very obvious ones, but what about these other ones where I'm going against the wishes of my community because of my Catholic values, Catholic social teaching, solidarity, etc.
Yeah, right. And it might not be imposing belief in an anti-democratic way, but or we could see it as kind of engaging in the religious pluralism of democracy and making a case, right, based on kind of one's identity and then seeing where the chips fall in terms of like political contest and voting. So basically, they don't talk about religion much. So the interviews were a fascinating thing because we started off in a way that we weren't trying to like prompt them to say the things that we were most interested in hearing about. So for example, we would ask questions about like, who are your most important partners in the local community? Most of them don't mention religious partners. Smaller town people will, but most moderate and large cities don't mention them. And then when we probed and we said like, well, what about religious partners? We'd often say, oh yeah, of course. They run some soup kitchens, they run a homeless shelter. We do a religious liberty day, that sort of thing. But as kind of a distinct entity, like a lot of religious stuff that scholars like me are interested in are kind of are off the radar, if you will. And we think a lot of it is because they're dominated by really pragmatic concerns, like day-to-day concerns. Now, the question about like, will they go for bat for things that are like important, not just to the community, but to their kind of are based in their ideals of what government should do and maybe their religious ideals. We had some examples from our interviews, and they were they were too complicated to easily put into a talk like this. It's going to have to wait for the book. But what we found was that they oftentimes had conflicts with religious groups, even religious groups that they were supportive of. So I remember very vividly one interviewee talked about how they, as a town, had gotten the local religious organizations really involved in serving the homeless, but the program just kept going off the rails. And it was for a number of reasons. Some of them were like efficiency reasons, right? They just weren't like getting the services out like they needed to. But then this official, who themselves, they were religious, the same religious tradition as the groups they were talking about, and they were supportive of the program. But they said, you know what? the program started making the homeless people listen to sermons before they'd feed them. And we in our local government are not going to do that. We're not going to have our services be based on, for lack of a better word, kind of religious test, right? Or being exposed to religion to receive a publicly funded service. And so this particular official was really worried about like what they were going to do with this group. So for the most part, most issues I think don't have a religious valence. I do think they go to bat on some issues around their religious identity, particularly when religious groups can do things that government can't do, or if there's a lot of push against government officials about the particular issue. Now, John, I knew this question was coming, so I'm going to scan down a couple of slides because I had a slide ready for this. So the huge caveat in these interviews is this, which was over and over again, we heard officials say things like, I am so glad that my level of government has nothing to do with abortion, that my level of government has no decisions to make about same-sex marriage. And all the quotes on this slide are from Republican Catholics in small communities. So what my hunch is that some of the stuff I've talked about the basic separationism is partly because, at least in the American context recently, some of these issues have really been usurped by state governments, state amendments, and of course Supreme Court rulings, kind of taking some of these controversials off of the laps of officials. And what I take from these parts of the interviews is that these officials and these issues are places where the officials would actually struggle and be thinking more overtly about their religious faith and about the policies that their local government was going to do. So I actually had this slide because I kind of had a feeling this question was coming. And in the course of analyzing the data, basically, I think this is really important. And I think what this says is that the pattern of federalism in the United States, at least as it operates right now, is taking some of these more hot potato issues off of local officials. And if you spend time with local officials, the last thing they want is a hot potato issue, because they're really oriented around basic things of public budget, services, and stuff like that. I don't know if I answered your question, John, but hopefully I gave it a little bit.
I see Eve. Welcome to take your question.
Thank you, and I beg your pardon. My English is not so good. I'm French speaking. I was wondering, in your research, did you have any reflections on what is expected by the hierarchy of the church on those Catholics in governing? What is the relation between what the self thinks and reflect, and how he is positioning himself before his bishop? Let's say that this way.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I think, again, the context of our research here, which is on the ground in local communities, leads to a very different question than if we were talking about people elected to the House of Representatives or governors or senators or things like that, whose work is very much in the public eye, who have the capacity to deal with some of those more religiously tinged kind of culture war issues. Our sense from talking with individuals, and I'm guessing there'd be some similarity with Canada in this, but there's a great deal of religious pragmatism and kind of that kind of individualization of religious authority that's really characteristic of religious people in the United States, especially Catholics. So we didn't have a sense that they were in relationship to the hierarchy, Catholic hierarchy, in any concrete way. They might go to the local parish and that thing, though even then, only 20% of the Catholic officials said they'd gone last week. So like the possibilities of that sort of interaction are pretty thin. This is also one reason why that I think it's safe to say that some of what the American Catholic bishops were doing about 10 years ago, when they were hyper focused on religious freedom in a very particular way, my hunch is it fell on a lot of deaf ears at the local level. And you can understand why, because it's often like officials are like, well, what are we going to do about it? But also their perceptions at the local level is that things are good. 90% of them said religious freedom is respected in our local community. So that's a very different mindset about the state of religion in the United States than the mindset that 10 years ago or so was more common coming from the Catholic hierarchy in the United States. So I don't know if that totally answers your question. I guess the last thing I would say is we asked a question on our survey where we said, if you were ever going to have a conflict about religion and state in your municipality, who would you turn to for advice? And the answer is they don't know who to turn to. So 50% of them had nobody to turn to. They had no answer. And then most of the rest of them said they would either turn to the attorney if there wasn't a city attorney, the American Civil Liberties Union, whose religious liberty stuff has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years, or they would basically turn to their state association of small town mayors. But we also know that those associations really aren't doing much when it comes to religion policy issues. So this is an area of I find exciting to research because there's not legal knowledge. There isn't a lot of resources that are produced, and there aren't these relationships with religious authorities to think about these things.
Yes.
We have a question in the chat from Richard Ibeck. Richard's curious whether there were any LDS officials in the sample, and would their attitudes on religion-state relations be more similar to those of Catholics or to those of conservative Protestants? And does it matter if they're in Utah versus other states?
So there are LDS in the sample. Because tonight was about Catholics, I focused on the Catholic interviews. I actually, off the top of my head, am not sure how many LDS interviews we had, but I actually appreciate this question because they're another religious group in the United States that has an intense geographical kind of a geographical location, which means that their ideas about religion-state relations could, if they wanted to, kind of play out more through local politics. I will say that in my kind of just reading of American political news over the last couple of years, Utah has been this really interesting state trying to deal with increasing pluralism, including religious pluralism. And as a matter of fact, they had this really interesting initiative a couple of years ago where the leaders of the LDS actually met with leaders of the LGBTQ community and in Utah and instituted some co-working groups with each other, issued a statement and issued some policy recommendations for how to basically how to deal with increasing diversity around sexuality in a state and in a religious climate that didn't have a long history of that, but how to do it in a way that it didn't become a battle between religious liberty and people's own sexual identity. So it's actually kind of an interesting place to think about what could be possible for local governments to do on these things. But I'm definitely not an expert, so I'll leave it at that.
And Sean.
Thanks, Caroline. Thank you, Gary, for your presentation. So full disclosure, I grew up in Connecticut, so West Hartford, and had a lot of friends go to Penn State right back in the 80s. So, I kind of have two questions. One is about, you mentioned the public square, the menorah, the Christmas tree, in a pluralistic society. There's lots of symbols that we need to come in, and they're certainly not all around winter, right?
Yep.
Eid is coming up in a few weeks. Is there anything happening in the public square in terms of that? And then, one of the things that I was looking at a few weeks ago, the mayor, right, of New York City, Zoran Mandani, right? He did the prayer breakfast, right? And that's something, again, that's a big thing. But I know in small communities, those have happened too. And his address was, I found exceptional. I mean, again, New York is so multicultural. He hit on so many different elements from church traditions and various religions across the world, ancient and modern, and I found it a very telling. So I guess in some ways, my question is about how do you incorporate some of those other things, and do you see prayer breakfasts as other ways of public people kind of getting involved? And I'm going to slip my second question first, and I'll come back to it. So, and it's more on the other side of it, not the politicians getting religious, the religious people getting more political. So I
Yeah.
mentioned this one because the Pope's from Chicago, in Rome via Peru. Um,
Yeah.
U.S. Catholic bishops in November and their message about immigration, how they confronted, the immigration policies, and then certainly religious leaders in their response in Minnesota, Minneapolis, and the spirit that grew out of that, and the churches that became centralizing to those areas, and the song and the singing that became really, interfaith and interspiritual in terms of from the other side, they're now impacting some of the public policy and the politicians, and they did some of the heavy lifting, so the others maybe could avoid some of those confrontations. So anyway,
Yeah,
two
maybe if
different
I can
areas.
answer those in reverse. So,
Yes, thank you.
we actually have somebody who's worked with our team who's finishing a dissertation in Minneapolis, and he's been there. He started in like 2019, so he's been there during COVID, been there during Black Lives Matters and the protests after that. He's been there through this, and he has some really interesting work coming out right now about just how one, how networked, especially in large communities, how networked and pluralistic a lot of religious organizations are now. So connections between Lutherans and Catholics and Muslims, organizations, that sort of thing. But also another piece of his research tells us that the local officials, they look to religious leaders in a different, they look to religious leaders though in different ways than 40 or 50 years ago. So some sociological studies from 50 years ago, political leaders look to religious leaders as kind of like these, kind of like to get a calibration of like what's morally correct in the community. That's gone, and in most American communities, especially communities that are bigger than 20,000 people. But there are still connections around some key issues. So like homelessness, service provision. Another one that we've seen is around like child trafficking. Another one is around opioids. Another one is around needs for immigrants. And so there's a level of which the quickness of the mobilizing religious groups in Minneapolis and other places doesn't completely surprise me, because my hunch is in the background they had some really good connections with the municipal leaders, and municipal leaders, I'm guessing, might have had some back channel conversations with them about like support for what they're doing, or hey, this is what the municipality is going to try and do. But for your first question about religious symbols, um, this is a really difficult issue, I think, for American politicians. And let me lay it out this way. So if you're in an area like a half an hour from where I live, so central Pennsylvania, um, it's generally a very religiously homogenous community, right? So most of the community is Christian or some sort of Christian heritage. Um, and it can feel easy for officials to have symbols and kind of just go with how it's always gone. But we know now that there are religious minorities in just about every community in the United States. And there's a question of how those religious communities are those people get on the radar of of like the local government. In cities and stuff, it's easier for them to get on the radar, right? They have a bigger presence, they have bigger organizations, and so officials more likely have to respond to that. What's interesting in all of this is that Americans famously kind of don't want to pay attention to religious diversity. There's some interesting survey evidence that say Americans want to do something like, yeah, there's religious diversity, leave it alone, let's not talk about it. But to actually make pluralistic holiday displays, for example, or to make pluralistic prayers at meetings, government, ironically, I think actually has to work harder to point at the religious diversity and to understand it. And that's just not something that most local governments are really trained to do. Most don't have, the staffing capacity to do something like that, to actually try and figure out what is the diversity of this community and what are the sorts of ways they would like to be symbolized. Let me make one last caveat here. We have a cool paper coming out, my co-authors and I, where we did an experiment with local officials and we asked them what they thought a Christmas tree was. And what's really interesting about the experiment, and we did this because we know most holiday displays have a Christmas tree, is that a lot of officials in the United States think that a Christmas tree is just cultural. And we have these really cool interview snippets from atheist local officials saying things like, it's just, it's a pagan symbol and we're just trying to celebrate the good times. And that's a really interesting thing because it means that Christmas trees might stick around for a long time because now both Christians grab it as a religious symbol and other groups grab it as a religious symbol. Pew has some really interesting data out that something like 25% of Jewish households in the United States have a Christmas tree. So this has become like this multicultural symbol. And so I expect things like that will become more important in governmental places over time.
Well, it's funny that you should mention Pew. Maybe Conrad Hackett's ears are ringing somewhere because there's a question in the chat that asks about Pew data. Ann Jameson is curious about some Pew research from back in 2021 about feelings about church and state, given that would have been soon after COVID, where people had feelings about masking and closing of churches. The part of the question is whether there's been a persistent memory of that time and perhaps left a bad taste in people's mouth.
That's a great question. I think the standard social science question now about COVID is that it mucked with everything. And it's actually hard to know like what was because of COVID and what wasn't. I'll give an example. The gold standard survey that sociologists use in the United States, they fielded a wave of their survey during COVID. And when they looked at the data, it looked like Americans had gone off a cliff in religion. Lot lower religiosity. What they found out was that people that were, through some analyses, people that were highly religious were less likely to talk to surveyors during COVID. And so they didn't show up in the survey. So we thought there was all this religious change because of COVID, but actually in the end, it may not have been anywhere near as drastic as we thought. What I would say about the question about like what was going on with masking in churches and stuff, this might be hard to do, but I want to dial your mind back to March 1st, 2020. That's when we knew something huge was afoot. And if you actually go back and look at the public opinion data, there was absolutely widespread support for all sorts of public health interventions. And it wasn't until about 6 to 8 weeks later that it got really politicized that all of a sudden you started seeing conflicts about this. And my co-authors and I published a piece where we were kind of lucky. We had just done a survey of local officials in Pennsylvania, like basically 2 weeks before COVID hit. And so we went back and interviewed them a month into COVID about their support for various policies. And there was widespread support for closing schools, closing businesses, and closing places of worship. And for the purposes of this talk, Catholic officials were some of the biggest supporters of closing institutions, including churches. And we think it has something to do potentially with maybe some of the solidarity, the sense of solidarity, the sense of common good that's cultivated within the Catholic religious tradition.
Well, I did give a warning in the chat that we had time for one more question, and Ann Jameson got the last question spot. So now I will just invite the audience to thank you, Gary, and then we'll have Peter close out with a few thank yous. So thanks, Gary.
Thanks so much. Please reach out if you have questions or contestations or ideas for me, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Gary, for a wonderful talk.
I feel like we've been working so hard to be with you in one space, and the weather is conspired against us this last time. But we're so grateful that you were able to make the time to do it this way. It was a bit of a flashback to COVID, but a very positive one. Um, at this point, I just want to thank a few people that were very critical to getting this evening's talk off the ground. As usual, I offer my thanks to Norm Clare from the Unmarketing Group for his AV guidance. Always a grateful thank you to Patience Silas, who coordinates all the details with regards to these talks, and to Courtney Winhold in our communications department for the promotions and marketing support. We invite you to be with us next for our next lecture in Catholic Experience on March the 12th, when our speaker will be Micah True from the University of Alberta. Micah is the author of The Relations, a biography, which is a biography of the Jesuit relations, which came out in 2025. He's going to be speaking to us on his most recent research, which also addresses the Jesuit experience in Canada. That is Anne of Austria's surgeon, Francois Gendron, the 17th century Jesuit mission to the Wendat, and the history of medicine. In this talk, he's going to be speaking about how accounting for the life and the experiences of this little studied participant in the Jesuit mission in New France yields important insights for our understanding of the earliest decades of settled Canada and how the knowledge produced in the Jesuits' missions there was received in France. And I hope that you can all be with us. Thanks so much for being with us this evening. Good night.